Welcome on Friday, December 5th. I understand you all volunteered to come to our presentation about JustCulture. My name is Leslie Crowell. I'm one of the Deputy County Executives, and I'll be conducting this presentation with Kathleen Sexton, the Director of Learning and Employee Development. And also we have plenty of executive supporters here. Paula Rentz, the CEO of the hospital, is here. And then Benita McLaren, the COO of VMC, is really acting as the JustCulture super champion, shall we say. Okay, to get some mentoring groups and some lunch bag talks and so forth going so that people can start to just start to feel their way through how we're going to do JustCulture. And I have a couple slides, and then I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen. But I'm really happy that we have a crowd of people here, because at first it's a big auditorium. We weren't sure we could fill it, and I'm just thrilled, and I hope it gets crowded in here. Encourage those people who come late to sit in the front. So at the end of this training, you'll know more about JustCulture depending on what you have or haven't heard. And I think I know a little bit about JustCulture because Jeff introduced it back in April of 2013 when he wrote about it in an op-ed piece in the Mercury News. And yet despite that year and a half plus of learning, I learn something every time that I talk about it, because really what JustCulture is about, it's about all of us and how we relate to each other. The slide presentation is really just a guide for getting us all talking about what it means to work together constructively for our own best work environment and also for good outcomes for our clients and customers. So you'll have a feeling for that at the end of this presentation, as well as some resources that you can use to get going. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kathleen Sexton.
Clicker. Okay. As we change our gear, because we're recording this session, so that's why we keep toggling back and forth. So good afternoon, I'm Kathleen Sexton, and I wanted to just get a sense of talking about, what is it and what do you know about it? So I'm curious about, what have you heard so far? You all sort of started hearing about it a little sooner than some of the other parts of the county because you started talking about it last year. So anybody want to just sort of say what you might have heard besides the expert over here?
For me, I've only heard the term JustCulture, but I haven't really seen or heard anything else about it.
So term yes, definition no. Okay.
We've heard the statement all over the place.
Okay, so hopefully today gives you a better sense of what that is and what it is here and what JustCulture means as it's relating to the county. So this is a snapshot of JustCulture. It is also on our JustCulture website that is available through the Connect site. There's its own set of pages on JustCulture. And really the foundations of JustCulture came out of healthcare as well as transportation and aviation and other emergency services. Really looking at errors and reducing errors and risk management. So that's sort of the premise, and it's really looking at a piece of it is being able to apply these principles to really create this culture that has open and honest conversations that may be about errors or mistakes, which is a large focus of JustCulture, but that may be open and honest conversations because it's a trusting, just environment in and of itself. And so we've applied that at the county to say that the result is really that all of these efforts around looking at how to improve conversations, accountability, just or justice type of culture, looking at systems that produce errors and mistakes, improving all of those components leads to a more organized, successful, efficient running organization. So ultimately, there's positive conversations and interactions, as well as some organizational process improvement. Or you can summarize it this way as well. So we're looking at all of those words, trust and fairness, mistakes and reporting, that are all going to, when they're all going directly and according, sort of rowing on the same path, leading to a just culture. So Leslie will end up saying that it's really a way of being. It's an organizational culture. It is not that we talk about just culture today and it's a program and we're done with it once we've trained everybody, that this is the start of an ongoing effort. And for all of you, you've actually started this last year, and we're sort of coming through as a second pass on this year in its rollout. It's just more county-wide in its rollout this time. And we're looking at introducing it a lot because Jeff, as Leslie said, talked about it as something that he wanted to apply at the county because of some errors that were occurring and people not feeling comfortable to be able to speak about some of those errors. Some of that was about Supervisor Shirakawa, and that led to this. But it ultimately ends up being an incredibly healthy process for an organization to be striving to achieve. And that was some of the impetus. If you watch Jeff Smith's 1-hour workshop that is on the JustCulture website. He talks at an executive leader meeting back in April of this year, and he talks much more about his philosophy around this and also why he rolled it out as part of his 10-year plan. And rolling out a little sooner than he anticipated, and he talks about that, but it was always part of his plan to push JustCulture out. So a little bit more about, well, what is it as it relates to the county? What we've been working with is really the three kind of fundamental pieces of JustCulture. So there's pieces that are looking at systems and processes and procedures, and are they working or are they promoting errors and mistakes and failures, and looking at if those aren't working correctly, other parts of the organization don't work correctly. Now, I think that healthcare is kind of a head start because a lot of your requirements in doing the work you do have you look at these system errors and reporting errors and doing some root cause analysis of why they weren't working. So your processes, as you're mandated to do, really have you starting on this piece in just the nature of your work. The applications of JustCulture are a little harder when you start to look at more of an administrative type of agency. So I work in employee services agency, and we have to think about, well, what are the business applications to errors and learning from mistakes and having conversations that help us grow and develop, because they're not the same as an error in patient care. It's different. But the fundamental principles of a manager's role is really to be accountable and hold others accountable and have conversations about what is working and isn't working, setting those expectations and having those follow-up conversations about that. And we talk a little bit more about elements of this through the session today. And then there's the same types of pieces of staff behavior. They need to be accountable, they need to have some clear communications, and they need to support these efforts. So we've geared our program to these three elements and tried to have a lot of the trainings we do steer around these three particular elements. So this is a lot of what we say JustCulture will strive to do. It is not a panacea. It does not address everything. It does not fix everything. It can be broad, but it's not that broad. It does focus in on particular areas, and in some cases focuses really on learning from errors and mistakes, having good conversations around that whole process. So there's a positive side to it as well as, yes, there might be errors that we're looking at, this gives you a sense of where we're trying to go with what it is. But we also need to cover, well, what it isn't, sort of what's out of scope of this particular thing. So it doesn't change the merit system rules that the county is held to about hiring practices and other things in the merit system rules. And it doesn't eliminate discipline. It might reframe how managers discipline, because there are different ways with the JustCulture methodology that you would discipline, but it doesn't eliminate it. We still have that progressive discipline process that we always have, and we encourage managers to be able to use that. We just give you a different frame of reference about how to use it. And it's not ignoring any kinds of contracts. It's not necessarily adding work. We're hoping that because of a focus on some of the conversations and looking at some of the systems, improvement occurs that makes us work more efficiently, not with a bigger workload. So at this point, any questions about what it is, what it isn't, needing clarification on some of the language at this point? All right. So I'm going to briefly show you some of the learning components that support this initiative, but ultimately it's what happens in the conversations back in the units and in the departments that makes JustCulture come alive, not what we're talking about in the trainings about JustCulture. So like I said, we geared a lot of our programming around these three key components. So right now, we're doing this particular course, and Leslie and I are going out to all the agencies and doing this course to large and small groups of executive managers and supervisors to get this message out. We have a group of people that are being trained by us in learning employee development and the county exec's office to go out and do trainings to staff about JustCulture individual behavior. So that is an additional course that we have a force of people that we are training to go out and do that training. And people from VMC, HHS as a whole have been going through those trainings up till this point, and then we have another large group of just VMC folks going through this Train the Trainer in January. This systems course has been modified pretty much every time I think we've had Jerry Talley teach that. If you haven't experienced Jerry, he's a brilliant guy teaching about systems and processes, how you analyze them, how they support or don't support the work, tools around that from the 5 whys to macro maps, root cause analysis. So the course that will be offered starting in I believe it's January and February, is now a half-day course on JustCulture systems. And that course is enrollable through SCC Learn, and those courses the registration for those courses starts at the beginning of January. The flyer that should have been over on the sidebar for you indicates some of those dates of the courses that are supporting these, that are coming out in the next 2 quarters. Jerry came to the executive leaders talk November 21st and talked to all the executives that were there that day about JustCulture as it relates to systems at a very high level. So he covered about an hour's worth of executives, are you looking at systems and asking some questions about workflow and processes and procedures at a high level, and the impact of knowing or not knowing those and how that's going to trickle down? And then the idea is that executives would send additional folks to this course and Jerry's other course on process improvement, which delves into much more actual tangible tools in process improvement. So that all is starting again at the beginning of January. Other courses are also listed on that flyer. We call them kind of additional JustCulture courses. Some are web-based, some are instructor-led. And then there is a website, and I will show you the link to be able to get to that website that has information about JustCulture and the courses, as well as any new information that we're hearing. We hope that next year we'll start to have some video clips of people in departments who can say, we applied JustCulture and here was the impact it had on us. We're starting to hear those stories in our training, and we need to capture them and start putting them out so people see that there is change that's slowly happening with this process. So these are the three we call them core courses. And then these are the groups, the waves as we call them, of different agencies that are going through the train the trainer to roll out that individual behavior course. So ultimately we would touch all staff, all managers, supervisors, all executives would understand what this is that we're trying to do as our first kind of pass at JustCulture. Then we'll be coming back and having ongoing dialogues so that it's not, like I said, a one-time set of training, but an ongoing way of being, organizational culture that we start to embed in the County of Santa Clara. So this is the flyer that you have. It got revised. This was the one that we were using for 2014. So hot off the press that you're getting an advanced look at next year's courses. And that this is our website that has Jeff's video, some of these other key slides, so that if you wanted to have a conversation with your group and say, I want you all to go understand a little bit about JustCulture, that you can take a look on this site for that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leslie to talk about manager's role in this process.
Thank you, Kathleen. So manager's role compared to team members' role, compared to executive's role, you may wonder, what is the difference? And it's very subtle, actually, because frankly, we all have the role of paying attention, of wanting to sort of work out loud and speak up about our work. How many of you have been in a staff meeting where you ask people in the staff meeting, you know, I'd like to hear what people think about X, or does anyone know what's happening in Y? And you get this. Well, JustCulture should hopefully create a little bit more comfort level with people speaking up. And your primary role is to help us get there, because it's about developing a work environment that fosters a comfort level around asking questions, around questioning processes even amongst one another, and so that people are not worried that they need to hide things, and that they learn from mistakes. And we're talking about risk also, because some of the people who are taking this course, and even people in departments that I'm talking to at the executive level, say we're feeling as though there needs to be a lower emphasis on error correction because error focus feels punitive to us. We're worried about the focus on mistakes. And I want departments to customize the material in a way that works for them. But at the same time, if we don't introduce the fact that we're going to make mistakes happen, then we're sort of avoiding dealing with it, and we're reducing our ability to help people feel comfortable that indeed mistakes will be made. So we don't want error to be a dirty word. And processes and systems are really what we need to be accountable for. You saw the word accountable a few times on that triangle slide, and we were just discussing accountability in another meeting I was in, and how that again is another loaded word, accountability. Who's accountable for what? Does that mean that somebody again will get in trouble, be held accountable, called into court, as it were, or something? And we thought, really, accountability is for the whole system, for the county. The patient doesn't know who runs the clinic. They just know they're there and they want some service. The taxpayer doesn't know whether it's the assessor, the tax collector, or the controller that's dealing with one or another piece of their tax bill. They just know it's the county. And so really when we're thinking about accountability, we're thinking about the end product to a certain extent, and then it's each of our responsibility within our job to be accountable. And so management knows, though, some of these sources of errors and at-risk behaviors from sort of that big picture standpoint, and yet in the county people are a little afraid to talk about risk, and so they're not quite sure what's the most important thing to be paying attention to. If nothing else, we all need to focus on X. There's the highest risk there. And communicating that kind of information so that people know that, you say the staff is not fully staffed that day and you're sort of double covering and things like that, where's the highest risk? Those kind of questions are part of management's responsibility. So we're talking here about behavioral choices, and we'll go into that a little bit later, and also have a fair and just disciplinary process where oftentimes in history before JustCulture, and certainly in the county, the disciplinary process was so tied to the person that if an event occurred, everything sort of went back behind closed doors. And people would talk and say, do you know what happened with XYZ? Oh, that's a personnel matter. We can't talk about that. Well, now the idea is that you'll separate the personnel procedure and the person from the event and the process that were related. And then the learning from that experience will get processed back out into the system, and managers, again, are more responsible for helping communicate back out to all the staff that as a result of something that occurred, the process is going to change thusly, or a team of people is going to get together to work on a process improvement so that we won't have that happen again. And so we're asking managers really to look at themselves and say, what am I doing to foster a sense of safety, of sort of freedom and openness to raise your hand and say, I don't get that. How many times have you had a staff person who didn't know what they were doing and they didn't want anyone to know, and they hid their lack of knowledge and made a mistake, and if only they had asked a peer a question or you a question, things would have been better. And that's what we're trying to avoid, so that staff people feel like it's okay to say, whoa, you're over my head here on topic X, or gee, I know I was assigned to do something over here, but I don't quite know how to do that. And also the single point of failure, so that you have more than one person who knows how to do things, and there are backup systems and so forth. And so we're going to be talking about just the different roles that people play. It is, in many ways, common sense. Because when you think about the difference between a small, even our family-centered unit, and I know the county executive likes to liken some of the family values to his vision elements. The problem with us, we're so big. And we have too many children, too many cousins. It's not a nuclear family. It's so extended that we don't all know what page we're on. And in many ways, JustCulture is about getting people on the same page and having people all have a clear understanding of both where their job fits into the big picture as well as clarity of their own job expectations. And so what happens when we have mistakes occur? Well, in a punitive culture, which I think a lot of people would say the county has had, there's a sense of blame, and that you just don't want to be near whatever the smoking gun was. And it's easier to sort of say, I didn't have anything to do with that. And you really are afraid to go to your boss and make a mistake. I know when I was a young analyst in the budget office, I left out 13 positions out of our salary system by accident. I just didn't capture them properly in the software. And they had to call the county executive at home on the weekend and rebalance the budget because of my mistake. And yet I know that I wasn't going to do it again. That really cemented it for me, boy. I better check my reports. And I was relatively new at the time, and I remember feeling kind of scared, but nobody punished me. They said, thank you for letting us know there's a problem. At least you found the mistake yourself. This is the kind of thing we want to foster, not do it right the first time or don't do it. More like, I hope you don't make that same mistake twice. And in a blameless culture, people sort of get away with things, and most people in the department are kind of frustrated that it always feels like there's somebody over there who's getting away with something and nobody ever does anything. And that creates a morale problem in the county. And we don't want that either. So what are we looking for? We're looking for the middle ground, where staff feels like we're all kind of responsible for each other. And would you like someone to come to you and say, gee, Leslie, did you mean to do it that way? Or would you rather find out from your boss, you know, someone came to me and said, Leslie, you were doing it wrong. Well, that doesn't feel very good. It feels much better if we sort of help each other out before something worse is going to happen. And what you don't want to do, you want to focus on discipline for the repeater, the negligent, or the sort of, I don't care. And create a learning culture where Jerry Talley, as Kathleen referred to earlier, said errors are opportunities for learning. And if you're not making mistakes, you're probably not trying anything new and different, if indeed that's okay in your job. Some jobs don't want new and different. And Amy Edmondson, who's a specialist at Harvard, she'll talk about framing the work. That in some places, the job of the boss is to frame the work so that in some places you know that there's a standard, it's always X, and in other places you can try all kinds of things and it's okay. And so there's human error, there is at-risk behavior, and there's reckless behavior. And someone was telling me a human error story the other day where, due to a clerical misunderstanding, a certain form about travel was not forwarded to the finance agency. And so they were dinged, if you will, on paper by email, paper mail, for having sent too many people to the same conference, which of course is one of our newer travel policies. There's a limitation on how many people can go to the same conference. But they had an exemption form filled out and they had good reason and so forth, but somehow it didn't make it to finance. Well, then the word trickled up into the county executive's office that this happened, and the person who worked on it felt terrible. And yet really they shouldn't have felt terrible. They filled out all the right paperwork. It was human error. And they were absolved of their error there. But at-risk behavior is when it's a little bit of that I'm not sure and I'm going to do it anyway type of behavior. And some people have used the analogy of speeding. I know the speed limit's 55, I'm going to go 65 anyway, etc. Probably nothing will happen. Well, depending on how the work is framed, this could be too much risk for you wherever you are. And then there's reckless behavior where the person knows it's wrong and they go ahead and do it anyway. And I see Trudy in the back. She has often said, if you trained several people exactly the same way, and then one of those people commits an error, what would the reasonable person that had had the equal training do? Is it something that this person should have known better given the circumstances? And you can kind of judge by looking at apples to apples. And so, really, human error is an opportunity to seek understanding. And David Marks, the father of JustCulture, he actually uses the word console. And that sounds a little therapeutic. Some of you might feel comfortable in the consoling environment. But other people think, boy, am I supposed to pat my employee on the head? So we said seek understanding felt a little more universal to us. This is something where the person probably feels badly they made the human error. They don't need too much coaching and consoling potentially, but they need to know that it's okay, hopefully they won't make the mistake again. You want to figure out how you can improve the process so it won't happen again. And at-risk behavior is a little bit of what David Marks calls drift. And we've all drifted. We have sort of somewhat harmless drift that I can attribute to myself, where I planned on making a certain number of phone calls or answering some emails, maybe even having some appointments, but I was interrupted. And then I forgot. And I did not get back to those people. I kind of drifted. I'm at a desk on the 11th floor, or I'm in a meeting. I can't really harm anybody by this. Although somebody who doesn't hear from me a while might feel that way. So, you have to sort of, again, in your role, are there jobs in your environment where this is more important than in other places? Some places, complacency just doesn't have a place at all. Other places, not so much. But look at this. Employee puts own needs ahead of potential risks. And this is a coaching and education opportunity. And how many of you think it's sort of hard to talk to employees after they make a mistake? Is it easy? No, it's hard. And yet if you don't do it, you're sort of losing an opportunity there to kind of nip this drifting behavior or this reckless behavior in the bud. Or if you have a feeling the person actually sort of teetering between reckless and risky, really is your job to notice that and take corrective action. And so here's where we're talking more about discipline, recklessness. There's some kind of intentional behavior, a choice with a capital C, where the person needs to know that what they've done is unacceptable. And reckless could be something where, again, the person should have known better. This is why when people have asked about what's the response from labor relations related to all these kind of things, and they've told us that the discipline process for every one of these types of cases will be very situational, because every situation is different. And so defining this kind of thing for people, I can see how as we start to get JustCulture more and more out into the organization, managers and their teams can start having conversations about, well, rather than treat everything totally case by case from the first, at least for us internally, so we don't get to the discipline place, how can we as a team think about where does the standard work in our unit fall under human error is probably okay here, reckless on the other side, and then sort of that risky. Where does our work fall? Unless it's not a problem. I don't think that in the budget office, my not calling a person back is a problem. On the other hand, if I leave the positions out like I did earlier, or if I get information, say, about a revenue estimate that would help budget additional dollars, and I ignore that, then I've definitely taken a risk or I'm being reckless as far as the county financial situation is concerned. So it's good for people to have sort of clear expectations about where the risks are in their respective jobs. And so you want to evaluate the nature of errors and develop process improvements. What makes it easier for everyone to do the right thing, whatever that right thing is for you, to achieve the best outcome for your patients, your customers. And then take appropriate action if there are errors, and then get the word back out. It's just sort of a circular process, if you will. And so take about 10 minutes to talk among your groups about, have you ever found yourself drifting into risky or reckless behavior at work? And are you currently analyzing these types of errors? And did you ever have a situation where this kind of thing cropped up and you actually needed to deal with it? So we can do that until a little before 3. You can just get together with those you'd like to talk with.
So, from the volume in the room, I am thinking that there was some good discussion going on there. We're hoping that this is driving some initial thinking about, what was reckless and how did I manage some of that? There is another conversation starter that is in your set of materials that you may want to take back to one of your departmental meetings and have a conversation about that to carry on the thinking around JustCulture as it relates to errors and mistakes and those 3 behaviors in a JustCulture. So that might be something to go back and work on. But what we wanted to cover is really the next or last module. So we've talked about the manager's role in JustCulture, and we looked at what are those 3 different cultures, JustCulture being the middle ground, and what are the different types of behaviors, and how would you use your management style to coach or educate or do some discipline around. The last one is really that we wanted to focus on is that JustCulture is really trying to look at how are we learning from failure and think broadly about failure and looking at, why is it important to be thinking about that? So here's some on the slide about looking at how do we end up managing to learn from some of the mistakes we make. I just had a staff person who was so apologetic for doing this the first time and making a mistake. And it was really, and she was like, oh, I should have asked earlier and I didn't and I'm sorry. And it was like, I'm really glad you asked. I'm glad you said something. Now we can fix this. I completely understand how you made that error based on what you knew at the time. And, I kept trying to reassure her, human error certainly wasn't even a at-risk drifting behavior, and let's learn from it. So we need to better document the letter that is going out to ask for training dates so that it's clear to you and it's clear to them. And it was something very fixable that we can learn from and move on from. So a piece of that is looking at how do we create what's called a psychologically safe environment where people feel comfortable to disclose and then have a discussion around it. And a healthy discussion, not a pointing fingers, blaming you did, she said, but a healthy discussion. So that's part of what we're looking at wanting to educate people on, give people information about. So this is just sort of a first step into helping you to create psychological safety in the workplace, so that it is feeling like people aren't going to have all of these happen. Some of the consequences, besides obviously being able to hear about errors, being able to fix mistakes, that you're really creating much more of an engaged organization. The motivation increases, your retention could increase, so there are some expanded benefits or consequences of this type of environment beyond just that we're fixing that problem, we're looking at that system. And like Leslie alluded to, Dr. Edmondson from Harvard is a person who talks about mistakes and learning from mistakes quite a bit in her research. So we're going to look at a video clip. It's a snippet of a piece of an interview she was doing with the Harvard Business Review where she's talking about this. And then we can, if you Google Amy Edmondson and HBR. You can see the entire article as well as the entire clip if you wanted, and there is an article you can buy through HBR that talks a little bit more about how she goes about recommending things she's discussing in this clip. So let's see if this works, because this is new, and I think you might have to click, Adrienne, on that.
So it sounds like one of the key things is getting people to speak up. How can leaders really make it an environment where people can speak up and where they're heard?
It is a crucial question. How can leaders create an environment where people feel free and comfortable to speak up with not just certain disasters, but their worries, their concerns, their maybe this isn't quite right kinds of ideas. And in the article, I suggest a set of strategies that I really do consider from my research as the best practices. And they start, interestingly, with framing the work accurately. And by that I mean leaders are in a position where they can explain the meaning and nature of the work that we do. If we do high volume manufacturing of automobiles and we want them to be exactly the same and perfect every time, that suggests one kind of work environment. That suggests an environment where it's got to be absolutely safe for people to speak up when they see something that looks just a little off, a little wrong, and to sort of stop and immediately figure out how to get to the bottom of it. If we're doing work that's in a scientific laboratory and we can assume that 70% of everything we try will go wrong, will fail, and then the leader's job is to make sure everybody realizes that so that they are in a position to make more failures more quickly than the competition and have discovery faster. So job one for the leader is to start with frame the work accurately. Tell the story of what kind of work we do and how failures fit into that. The second thing is embrace messengers. Don't shoot them, embrace them. It will never feel like a happy day when someone comes to you and says something's wrong. Resist the urge to get annoyed, frustrated, and take it out on them. Instead, celebrate and thank their willingness, their courage to come forward. A third strategy is to set up structures and processes through which the failures that do occur are learned from carefully. Multidisciplinary teams, systems, protocols that help people do this well, because our inclination is to just do it quickly and get back to the real work. That is part of the real work.
Okay, we need to go back and do our editing a little bit there, because that's the one snippet we wanted you to hear, and that spending the time on this is the real work is something that we think is really key to this, that taking the time to do that analysis, have those conversations, bring other people involved in that error process to learn is the work that the manager should be doing. So, understanding the concept of what psychological safety is, Dr. Edmondson isn't the only one who's written about it, but she has quite a bit on that. Framing the work she has talked about. Embracing the messenger. But then in her article, she also goes on to really acknowledge the limits. You know, what you're open to as far as a mistake and not. So where does it fit in that human error, at risk, reckless? Invite participation into looking at what occurred and how could we learn from this? What are we going to change? And setting boundaries and holding people accountable. So that, again, you're not just dismissing and what is going on in the error or not providing discipline, but you're really making sure people understand what are the expectations that you're going to hold them accountable to. So that's the other piece of this. What we wanted to do is just have you briefly go back to those groups that you were talking with, maybe 5 minutes. Think about what's the psychological safety level on a scale of 1 to 10 in your department, and how would you maybe just bump up that safety level a notch, 1 or 2 notches? What would you need to do in your role to make that happen? So if I'm looking at the clock at 10 10 after, let's go ahead and reconvene and we'll do some wrap up of additional information and next steps. Cheese theory of failure, so that if all things line up correctly, you can actually, have a very large failure. And how do we end up trying to avoid that? Or how do we analyze it when that's occurred? The importance of looking at systems and where there might be these holes in the systems that create a bigger error. And examples of what system failures might look like. The technique of the 5 whys, so just keep asking why and why did this happen and why did this happen to try to understand the root cause. So it's a sort of very simple root cause analysis tool. Another quiz. And then in reframing the elements and what's the middle ground again. And another discussion about, well, what's your role? What can you do? Relating back to that starfish story, and what's your one piece? I can't change everybody else. I have an influence over me, and what am I going to do to change the environment toward a just culture? And then there's a clip that they see, a snippet of what Jeff Smith's larger talk is about. And then getting started, what are some of the pieces that they can start doing, the small steps? And then some of the resources that you've also seen, so website and different courses. Oops. So that's what staff are seeing. The rollout of that hasn't necessarily started in all of the HHS agencies. It's going depending on the queuing up of those. Public Health has gone ahead and started the individual behavior courses. VMC hasn't. Mental Health DADS is still in the training process with us, so it's rolling out in different stages. But we want to talk lastly about what are some of the next steps, so I'm going to turn it back over to Leslie for that.
So here's what we're looking at coming up. It's essentially a process that's happening by custom design in every department. And Just Culture really is sort of a customized process because we all have different jobs. We all have different levels of involvement. Some people are on shift situations. Some people have 24/7. It's variable everywhere in the county. So we want Just Culture to feel like you've created it in a way that will work for you. Jeff Smith does not want people to be just sort of checking Just Culture off. I saw a 1-hour presentation, I have Just Culture, now I'm going to go back to my desk and do everything the way I've always done it before. Then what would be the point? So what he really wants this to do is essentially start a county-wide, as appropriate, conversation about how we do work. And so we've trained 2 people for every 200 or 1 for every 100 employees in the county. That's what we've done it or we're in the midst of doing it now. And the people were either nominated by their departments or they volunteered to become trainers. And this idea actually came up because Jeff had a road show. It was actually in this room. And he talked to some employees who said, could we be part of the training program? And they were SEMA employees. And so once we started the training with that idea in mind, the reality of I'm going to be up in front of my whole peer group and I don't even know what the managers think about this. So that's when they said, could we have the executive manager and supervisor training before we really roll it out at the staff training level? And we're happy to do that for people. We really don't, we're sort of agnostic about how this gets around. We've had people say, I don't really need to train, I can just sort of live it for a while in my department, model behavior, talk about it, have some small conversations, and there's really not a wrong way to do it as long as we're thinking about it. So that's essentially what this slide says, is have conversations and get coordinated with the trainers, and then start incorporating these principles into policies, department new employee orientation, performance appraisals and safety practices. And then at some point, this was done a little earlier where we thought it might be rolling out sooner or faster, but actually departments are taking quite a bit of time to customize it to their liking. And we haven't quite figured out, and we're going to need your help and the trainer's help and the executive sponsor's help. How do we measure whether this is working? Whether it's something that is sort of worth the investment. Now, we believe it's worth the investment, but how would Jeff Smith say prove that to the Board of Supervisors? And I'll just leave you on that note there. It's a big question, but I'm happy to answer any questions you have, and Kathleen is here as well.